So if we could start the meeting, can I just remind members of Executive that we have got people listening outside, so if you could remember to use your mics when you're speaking, please. Item 1, apologies for absence, I believe we're all present. Item 2, minutes of the previous meeting, can we agree those as true records? Thank you. Item 3, I'm not proposing to vary the order of business. Item 4, are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Chenchi.
Thank you, Chair. Paper 7, the development at Ravenswood, I think that there's a potential for there to be a conflict of interest with the Curie one, and I would rather leave the room when you are considering that one. Thank you.
Anyone else? No? Okay. We can then move on to item 5, residence parking zone 1. Councillor Smart.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is by way of seeking authorisation for Head of Service to put right a matter which has gone on for some time and there was the subject of a portfolio holder decision. As the report says, there was a period when there was a review of residence parking, but part of the review of residence parking was to do with a particular zone and some particular features of that zone to do with advertising, the ability for people to have second permits and various things like this. Unfortunately, what happened at the time was that the proposal to increase the charge for residence parking was contained within that experimental order, and on lapsing, the charge officially reverted to what was in place before. So we've been charging too much for too long, one might argue. This is to rectify that situation. Legally, of course, we do have to offer reimbursement to anybody who feels that they were overcharged during that period. And that is what the second recommendation is about, to authorise the Head of Service to make these payments. It's fairly straightforward in the case of those people who were at the time permit holders and who still are permit holders in Zone 1, because we know who they are and we can contact them and so on. Of course, different people may qualify for different amounts of money because they may have been residents in that area for different amounts of time. In the case of people who have moved away and no longer on our database, this might prove a little bit more difficult, which is why, as is mentioned in 4.1, various methods are being employed to advertise the fact that some people may be entitled to a refund over this period. Just to say on 4.1, the public advertisement, although this paper says that it has happened, it is so close to happening as to be almost effectively true. Certainly, when this paper was prepared for this agenda, the assumption on behalf of the paper's author was that by the time we got to the meeting, it would be ready. If anybody wants an absolute update on that, but I suspect that by the time the research has been undertaken to tell them when it's going to be advertised, that process will be complete. It's that close, I understand. If there are any questions on any of this, Mr. Newsham is with us this evening to perhaps pick up anything that somebody may want to ask. But we are, I think, doing our best endeavours to put right a situation that was inherited from a little time ago.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything to the statement, Mr. Newsham?
No, thank you, Councillor. I've got nothing further to add to what Councillor Smart has said, but we'll be happy to try and answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Chinchi.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, totally, obviously agree with the recommendations. Just wanted to know if we've looked across the board if there are any other issues that might crop up like this, and what we're doing about other orders, or whether over your scrutiny might need to just check that this doesn't happen anywhere else or happen again in the future. It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it?
I would certainly agree that it's embarrassing for anyone who was in the administration at the time. Yeah, sorry, I would agree that it was certainly embarrassment for anyone who was in administration at the time. Not that I'm suggesting they should be surcharged in any way. I think that the situation with this has moved on in that any future traffic orders to make any amendments to residence parking schemes would be would fall upon Suffolk County Council, who now have the powers, because this was all done under the agency agreement when it existed. That agreement no longer exists, so the powers contained to make these orders would reside with Suffolk County Council. So in that regard, it's unlikely that if this sort of thing happened again, that it would be us that would have made this mistake, because that's just a change that's happened. As far as any other aspects of the council's functions, I know of none, but then I would not know about any other council's functions. It's just one of these things. I can't think off the top of my head of any similar set of circumstances that would arise.
That shows you how difficult it is in the council.
I think we have had a trial. We're not aware of any further experimental orders that have lapsed.
Just to confirm, as part of this process, I did have the opportunity to check the orders that are in place for zones 2, 3 and 4, and I'm not aware of there being any problems with their legalities. Likewise for the council's off-street parking places order, which is the other thing that we're responsible for. But as Councillor Smart said, in respect of other on-street orders, that's now a function of the County Council. Residence parking is slightly different because it's something which we still administer on the County Council's behalf by the Civil Parking Enforcement Agency agreement that we have with them, which is a separate agreement to the old Highways Agency agreement we used to have. But to reassure you, as part of this process, we've had a trawl through a very large number of legal documents, and I've not found anything else that I believe is legally deficient.
Good. Thank you.
Any further questions? No? Can we agree recommendations as well?
Agreed.
Thank you. Let's move on to item 6 then, Homes and Communities Agency Affordable Homes Programme, Councillor Mullins.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, can I say that I believe the report is full and I believe very clear. But I will go through various items for the benefit of the Executive and others. This report, as it states, refers to a bid to the Homes and Communities Agency by the Borough Council. We did that in conjunction with a consortium as referred to in the report. And it also refers to the successful result of that bid. It also considers whether to accept the funding offer, and if so, how that funding can be best used. Bids were invited some while ago for funding towards new affordable housing, and our part of the consortium's bid was for 100 new homes. That was the guideline figure rather than just something that we plucked out of the air. But the HCA, Homes and Communities Agency offer, is based on that number, 100, and equates to approximately £1.5 million to this council. The conditions relating to the funding are set out in the report, but that is that the new properties must be let at affordable rent or sold as shared ownership, or they can be supported housing or housing for older people. As the council has got at the present a new build programme, it obviously makes sense to try to fit it into that, and we can take advantage of the funding on offer and apply it to one of our current development schemes. The relevant options therefore for us are affordable rent or shared ownership. If I can very briefly refer to those. Affordable rents homes are rents set at 80% of market rents as laid down by government, and any annual rent increases would be laid down in accordance with a laid down formula by the government, but would not be the same as the government's rent restructuring policy, which applies to social housing such as our own. Shared ownership, the government conditions are laid down, but principally purchase of shared ownership leases can be bought on an initial, they have to buy an initial share of 25% based on the market value, and they pay a rent which is limited. Again, there are laid down procedures and figures, but they have to pay a rent on the remainder. They don't have to buy 25%, they can buy an increased amount from the start if they wish, but certainly if they, whatever they start from, a greater share in the property can be purchased as and when the purchaser requires, and the rent obviously then on the remainder is reduced accordingly. Now, we don't have to accept the HCA offer, but £1.5 million, of course, is not an inconsiderable sum, and that could enable our building programme to be accelerated somewhat. And in the light of demand, which we all know about, that is obviously to us a significant factor. On the matter of actual utilisation of the funding, details of our 4 sites are included in the report. HCA conditions and timescales, which again are referred to in some detail in the report, make the most obvious and suitable option to be that relating to the Ravenswood scheme. Though the proposed development here is slightly below 100, in fact there would be 94 as agreed by the executive previously, we understand that we could either forego the amount of HCA funding attributable to the shortfall, or utilise such funding elsewhere if appropriate site or sites can be found. Obviously it would be better to make sure that we can use the full benefit if we do get this funding and arrangements agreed. The previously agreed scheme, which was for 94 dwellings, comprises of 46 one-bed flats, 46 two-bed houses, and 2 4-bed disabled adapted houses. In the light of the HAC offer, the property tenure of this development has been reviewed completely, and the proposals set out have been revised. And those revised proposals are to offer 24 of the properties, 12 flats and 12 houses, that's 12 one-bed flats and 12 two-bed houses, as shared ownership. To exclude from the HCA funding arrangements the 2 larger houses for retention within the council's ownership for social rent, because we are in desperate need of that kind of accommodation, and let the remaining 68 properties, that's 34 flats and 34 houses, at affordable rents. This would mean that the number of the properties on this site, included under the HCA scheme, there would be 8 which would not be covered by the funding for 100. I'm sure we can do something about finding a site or sites for that. But up to now, the council hasn't itself provided any shared ownership properties. The proposal to include 24 of them, therefore, would be a pilot scheme, so that we could see how that goes. And I believe that it would go some significant way to addressing the views of Ravenswood residents. In the circumstances, Chair, I'm pleased to present the report. As I said before, I believe it's a very full, comprehensive report. I don't wish to say anything else other than to say that I'm pleased to put forward the recommendations which are at paragraph 16 of the report, which are as follows. First one, to accept the offer, the HCA offer. I'm sure there'll be some I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed, but I don't think that seems to be an insurmountable problem. Apply the funding to the Ravenswood scheme as detailed, i.e. for 92 properties, and to identify site or sites for the remaining 8. The tenure on the Ravenswood site to be, as mentioned, 68 affordable rent, 24 shared ownership, and the 2 4-bed houses would remain for social rent. agreed to submit that to HCA for approval, submit an appropriate amendment to the planning application, and authorise those who will be responsible to effect all of these recommendations. And in that respect, there is a very minor amendment which I ought to make to the recommendation under 16.4, and where that recommendation, it should refer to delegation to the head of resource management and not to the head of corporate resources. But apart from that, Chair, everything else is there, and I move those recommendations.
Thank you, Councillor Moles. Schofield, Southern Water Study. Are there any questions? Councillor Chenchu.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to go through a little bit of logical process before I answer my question. The papers that are listed, other helpful papers, show that in 2009 we were actually looking to build on here in previous administration. Unfortunately, in 2010 when we put it out to tender, that paper not being shown as other helpful papers, we couldn't get any developers interested, so that's why there was a bit of a pause. But it's confirmed in the papers at 2.5 that we have until 30th of May 2016 for the HCA's deadline and finalising of the schemes. I think that's plenty of time for us to find the required numbers. If the Executive insists on building the numbers and the tenure as outlined in 16.3, then we will still need to find other sites for the remaining 8 needed to receive funding. So if we have to find further sites anyway, let's consider what the residents are asking for within our restraints. In 2009 we agreed 55% would be affordable. Therefore, in keeping with the previous administration's passing at that Executive, I would like to ask that the recommendation in 16.3 be changed to 52 affordable homes, 24 shared and 18 private, plus the 2x4 bedroom adapted properties. I think this will help the residents to agree a way forward, plus give a fair share of social housing on the site, and then we would have to find the other sites, the other houses in other sites, as we will have to do anyway. And it will make it more of a pepper-potted approach, and we will still have the benefits of the funding. I also want to add in that I'm wondering whether there is another development there. There's been a little bit of a rumour going that there's another development at Ravenswood, so I'd quite like to know if that's on the cards, or is this the last part of the building on Ravenswood. So in all, the Conservatives are asking that 16.3 be changed, as I've just outlined, for us to agree the recommendations.
Is that a formal amendment you're moving?
That's a formal amendment.
Can you just read it out again, please?
Yeah. Executive resolves that the properties to be built on the development at Ravenswood UVW are 52 affordable, 24 shared, 18 private, and in addition to the 2 4-bedroom adapted properties, which will remain social housing.
Thank you. Is there a seconder for Councillor Chenchu's amendment? No, then the amendment falls.
Can I second it?
No, you're not.
Okay, right.
Said so. I believe there was a question that Councillor Chenchu asked around further development on Ravenswood. Is anybody able to answer that?
There is a further development on Ravenswood, Councillor. It's a private development that we're not involved in, apart from being planning authority.
May I come back on that, please, Chair? Ask a
Yes,
question.
Councillor Chenchu.
Is there any way going forward that that may change and not be a private development, or is that set in stone and that's...
We certainly haven't thought about approaching the owner to purchase the piece of land, and it would come down to us at any point, if we were considering it, to have to work up a business case to justify the expenditure, and you know what they were asking us for the cost of the land and whether we could afford it.
But the HCA funding, if we were to put others and minimise the amount and put other council houses on that new development, the HCA funding would come into that, wouldn't it? Find the extra houses if we wanted to do that. Don't worry if you can't answer that
I'm
now.
not.
And it needs some thought, because I know I've put you on the spot there.
Yeah, that's.
But if you want to look at that, perhaps put it in writing to me. I just want to make sure that we all have an understanding of that second development.
Councillor Church, if I may, as property portfolio holder, what we are concentrating on with our house building programme is land in the ownership of the council.
I know.
We're not looking at purchasing further land at the moment. There are plenty of sites available, some of which have been outlined in this report. And certainly I can say we are not, certainly not, you may plant a seed, but we have hitherto been looking at repurchasing land on Ravenswood, and I don't anticipate that we will do so.
Okay.
Are there any further questions?
May I just simply, I simply want to welcome this as good news. You know, I think it's very good that we've got this extra money as part of a successful bid, and I think all housing that we get built or developers get built, if it is of good quality and so on, is very good news for people needing homes. And I think here it's very good news for people in need of decent housing, including, I would imagine, young people hoping to get onto the property ladder who may be attracted by the pilot shared ownership scheme. So I'm very happy with this, and it's good news.
Thank you. Councillor Smart, you indicated?
I was only going to offer my own experience in this regard. It's not just the people who would be wanting a shared ownership who will want to get on the property ladder, but those who would want housing purely for rent. So few people can afford the sorts of deposits now that are required by the lending institutions in order to start a home. And I can remember when I was in the fortunate position of being a council house tenant, and that enabled me to do something which young people today find very, very difficult, and that is to save the deposit, because they had access to cheaper rent. Now, that is probably about the only way that people can hope to save the sorts of deposits that are being required. And I welcome this as much for that point of view as simply trying to tackle the problem of a housing shortage of affordable housing, because the alternative would be, if you put all this on the open market and you had buy-to-let landlords buying it all up, you've no idea what the behaviour of the tenants might be. But because it's under the auspices of the council, it's a far better bet in terms of managing social housing.
Thank you. And certainly, I don't believe we should be passing up the opportunity to access this funding. £1.5 million, as Councillor Marsh said, is a not insignificant amount of money. Will enable us to accelerate our housing programme on the sites that we have already identified, and obviously in terms of the change in tenure mix that we're now proposing, there will be that opportunity for 24 shared ownership properties. We know that it is becoming increasingly difficult for young people in particular to get a step on the housing ladder. The average age of first-time buyer now is 35. It is very difficult for people to buy homes. So the fact that we are now able to offer 24 shared ownership properties, I think, would be welcomed by most people in Ipswich. If we could then go on to the recommendations, I think some of them are dependent on others. So I think if we perhaps just take them one at a time rather than together. So 16.1, that we accept the Homes and Communities Agency funding, and all those in favour, please. Thank you. It's carried. 16.2, that we resolve that Ravenswood will be the recipients of that funding. All those in favour? Those in
Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Chinchi. 16.3, the tenure mix outlined. All those in favour and against?
Could that be recorded, please?
And with your agreement, I think 16.4 onwards are just procedural recommendations. If we can take those all together. All those in favour and against? Thank you, that is carried.
Sorry, can I just chip in? Are the council addressing the legal challenges regarding the Ravenswood tenure?
If we can perhaps respond to that outside the meeting, it's not appropriate at this stage to
Okay.
take questions from the board. But if you want to speak to somebody after the meeting, then we will do that.
Done. Thank you.
Item 7, then development at Ravenswood UBW tender award. We just give Councillor Chenchi time to leave the room.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Moles.
Thank you, Chair. As the description at the beginning on the front of the report says, this is detailing the preparatory work that's been carried out in respect of a contractor to carry out the housing development on land at Ravenswood, if in fact planning permission is granted. And I would refer you specifically to paragraphs 10, 4, 5 and 6 of the report on page 49, because it states there quite clearly, as planning permission has not yet been granted, the contract could be let in 2 phases, and the recommendation is that that be the case. And that's the first phase will be for what's known as a limited letter of intent to be issued to the successful tenderer. That's the basis on which this is being discussed, and the recommendation in the closed session will be made. I'm not sure there's anything else I need to add to the report, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Moles. Officers wish to add anything? One very straightforward report, which we've had several now for various housing sites. Are there any questions from anybody? No? Can we agree with recommendations then? Agreed. Thank you. We could perhaps retrieve Councillor Chinchi.
Did you make a speech? Okay.
Welcome back, Councillor Chinchi. Now on item 8, Ipswich Local Development Scheme Review, Councillor Jones.
Chair, this is an annual paper that comes to Executive. We review our local development scheme every year. It's a legal requirement to do so. What it is basically is the work plan for the local plan. And what this one covers today is under 4.1. It's the timing key documents. We have one Inglorious Technicolor on the table. We have 2 new SPDs to be prepared, one on air quality and one on cycling strategy for Ipswich. And the third one is to revoke the documents listed under 4.14, one document that's been superseded, and 4 others where sites have already been either built out or are being built on as we speak and are no longer relevant. So I think, Chair, that's actually all I have to say. Thank you.
Do we still have anything, Mr. Hall?
No, I've made a point.
Other questions on the report? Yeah, okay. So So if we could agree the recommendations at 13, all those in favour? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Move on to item 9, then annual review of carriage fares. Councillor Scarlett.
Yes, thank you, Chair. What we're dealing with here is, well, it could be a resolution to increase the fares, but officially what it is approval of advertisement of intent, so to do. This is what happens every year, that the trade themselves put forward a proposal. They do that within a kind of envelope of inflation. So they look at the different stages in the fare tariff and apply an average increase within the capabilities of the metering systems to produce. And it's then put to us, and we have to, as the licensing authority, advertise to see what objections or other proposals come forward. And that is what's being proposed. The author of the report, Debbie Devine, sent her apologies. She's not able to make a meeting today, but I'm sure the head of service, Mr. Ling, is perfectly capable of fielding any questions anyone may wish to put. It's very much the procedure that we adopted last year. The tariff is usually worked out by the Station Taxi Tenants Association. And so, as part of the consultation we undertake, we will be writing to other hackney carriage drivers who are not members of that association to ensure that they support this proposal as well. So that's what I wish to say, and urge people to support the recommendation. But if they've got any questions, we'll try and sort those out.
Nothing to add, thank you, Chair.
Questions, Councillor Chinchey?
Thank you, Chair. In 12.3, where it says, well, we're talking about the average price of diesel, which was obviously what it was at that time, but I believe that diesel has now gone down, and that this rise is actually more than CPI. It's not that I'm totally against it, but it's just asking the question, how are we looking at that, considering everybody's having to make allowances in their rise in their salaries, that they can have more than the CPI, and they got 2.6 last year as well, and diesel's going down.
I think the thing you have to do is to look back a little bit further than simply last year and look at the freeze that was on the previous year in spite of cost pressures. As far as the actual price of diesel on a given day, two things I would say. First of all is that the price of diesel can be very volatile, go up or down, and you've got to try and make a guess as to what it might be forecast to do. Every time a pound, for example, reduces in value against the dollar, the fact that oil prices are priced in dollars, currency fluctuations can affect situations like this, and obviously we're in a slightly volatile period at the moment. I think the other thing to look at is whereabouts we are in if you like, the league table of the most or least expensive, and we seem to fall in somewhere around about the middle, and obviously where we are in that league table changes all the time as other people review their fares and so on. As I say, what is being proposed is an advertisement of an intention. If there are objections from other members of the trade or from the public, obviously they will come back to this committee and we can consider again as to whether we confirm or amend the proposal before us.
Okay, thank you. That's fair.
Thanks. I'm right in saying that we, in terms of the league tables of expense and tax advertisement fares, we did used to be significantly higher up that table than we currently are.
I haven't got all of the figures, league table figures going back over many years. The report just says that we're 131st at the moment. It says 365 authorities, but I'm not quite sure how many of those are licensing authorities.
my recollection is we were much higher, and then the freeze actually
Yeah.
just significantly
We're in the top 10, I think, at one point.
Okay, are there any other questions? No. Report. So can we agree recommendations to accept consultation? Move on to item 10 then, annual carbon reduction report.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and welcome to Catherine Kitton, who's the author of the report, who's joined us to answer any questions that anyone may have on this. What we've got here is a statement which I think is good news, the fact that we set ourselves a target and have been able to achieve it over time. I think that reading between the lines of the report, it hints that it might get a bit more challenging going forward to keep chipping away at the carbon block, if you like, because certain initiatives are fairly, what we like to call low-hanging fruit, things we can do fairly easily, and we've probably done a lot of those already. There is another report that is being prepared, looking forward to where we might go from here in terms of trying to continue progress towards the full 50% target, but that will be for another occasion. What I would say, and I think it's quite important looking on page 6 of the report, right at the top in 4.7, is that as well as being a good thing for the environment, it's also a good thing for the Council's budget. As we've saved more and more carbon, so we have saved more and more on our energy bills. If you look at the figure of about 440,000, that's something in the region of 70,000 a year, perhaps over the 6 or 7 years that we've been doing this. And of course, a lot of the gains that have happened in more recent years will stay with us, so that will form a baseline moving forward for the savings that stay within the local authority's budget. Because usually the more progress you make in this area, the more it stays with us, the benefits are there for future years. So, as I say, we've got officers here to answer any questions anyone will have, and I look forward to presenting a further report to you on the way ahead from now.
Do you want to add anything at this stage, Mr. Are there any questions on the report? No. Good news. Save the planet, save the planet. Can we agree recommendation 13.1 then to note report? Thank you very much. Thank you. Then move on to item 11, financial management control of budget monitoring. Councillor Cook.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. Hudson's here to help with the questions, as usual. As you know by now, this is a quarterly report. It comes every 3 months and gives a basic status update on where we are with the Council's finances. This report covers quarter 1, so in other words April, May and June, and as is typical because it comes in the summer, all the way on holiday, it arrives relatively late, and the quarter 2 report will be not far behind this. As far as sort of key issues to highlight, I think first of all section 5, financial performance in the general fund, it is the most noteworthy. In section 5.5 we identify the additional supplementary estimate of £120,000 that's been requested in respect of bereavement services. As councillors know, the trading conditions for the bereavement services arm of the council have been difficult since we sort of reopened after refurbishment with the introduction of competition from the Seven Hills facility, which opened I think during 2011-2012. There are a number of actions that officers are working up, which are set out in 5.8 to try and improve the situation there and improve our market share over time. What we clearly want to do is to reduce the £120,000 supplementary estimate as the year goes on, if we can, but certainly shouldn't underestimate the amount of work that needs to be done in that service area in order to sort of turn things around. I don't think it's in any way an easy task. In section 5.9 we list out a number of other items which, whilst they don't require supplementary estimates at this point in time, are under a careful watch and monitoring as we go through quarter 2 and beyond. I think also from section 10 it's probably just worth highlighting through 10 and 11 really the situation with the capital programme, which is relatively tight but also as ever fairly unpredictable in terms of when capital receipts might come. This is something that will be monitored, and we do have borrowing headroom if we have a mismatch between when receipts come and when expenditure is required, so we have a certain amount of flexibility there. In section 12 on treasury management, I think 12.2 is particularly noteworthy. Again, this is another quarter where we haven't undertaken any new borrowing, and I've lost count of how many quarters that's been the case for now, but it's a significant number. So our borrowings are 657,000 lower at the end of this quarter than they were previously. And further through that section 12, it highlights some of the investments that we've been making, which, whilst they're still at sort of relatively low levels of interest, there have been a few other deals on fixed rates or notice that we've taken advantage of, which have increased the investment income a little above what we might have expected. So that's fairly good news. I think probably, Chair, that's all I wanted to highlight.
Councillor Cook, do you want to add anything at this stage, Mr. Smith?
Not at this stage, thank you.
Are there any questions on the report? Councillor Chench.
Just really to have our fears allayed about taking out of the reserves, which I believe this is what we're doing, and to mention that there was a peer review a year ago, 18 months ago, and one of the two things that they said we shouldn't ever do is overestimate income and use up reserves, and we seem to have done both. So I'm a little bit concerned about these other ones where we haven't got a report on other shortfalls. My question there is, will we get a report so that we have this, even if it's to say everything's okay, just so that we have an ongoing situation there? And what are we going to do about the crematorium if we don't make those differences? I think we're going to have to be a little bit more creative than the list that's in 1.8.
Councillor Cook.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Could I just clarify which reserves Councillor Chench is talking about? I presume service reserves in section 9. I mean, that is, I think it's important in this area that we're very clear that...
The additional commitments is a reserve.
Okay, but what I'm thinking is that over the last couple of years, the Council's reserves have actually been added to and have been built up to a higher level than we'd seen previously. But are you referring specifically to the service reserve in 9.1? Which reserve are we talking about?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question. When I asked
I
one
didn't
about the
understand
additional...
yours, Councillor.
This is coming out, this is what we're approving in 19.2, is that it's coming out of additional commitments. Well, we haven't got any choice by the looks of things. But what I'm saying is that generally, if we've got shortfalls that we're going to have to take out of reserves again and again, one, how are we going to monitor that? How's the executive going to see that? And two, is this going to be a trend again for the crematorium going into the future? I mean, we need to do something about the opposition, the competition that we have on the crematorium. And it might be we never ever get there. We never ever get that custom back.
Chair, perhaps if I could just say, I mean, what this report highlights on is obviously the areas where we have problems or difficulties, and the crematorium is foremost amongst those at the moment.
Yeah.
But the general trend in the Council's accounts at the moment is that we are underspending and that the financial position is better than budget. This is just one example where it's worse. For sure, we do need to do something about it, and I think the actions that are being looked at are highlighted in section 5.8 there.
I mean, if I could just highlight, if you remember Councillor Chench's budget that we agreed in February this year, agreed that the use of the reserves will be over 4 years, whereas the budgets that have been previously agreed by your administration were proposing to use up reserves over 3 years. So we are actually in a better position with reserves now than when your administration was in charge of this council. I guess you can prove anything with statistics, can't you, Councillor Church?
Yeah, you can, that's right.
But this is cold hard cash. Are there any further questions? No? Can we agree with recommendations? Thank you very much. We move on to item 12, to agree loans from Ipswich Borough Council museums, collections and holdings museums.
Thank you. This is one of a series of papers here. You'll see a rather splendid list of items. You'll see that at 5.2 that the chair of the Friends of Ipswich Museums is content with this and asks that they be included in an exhibition in Ipswich in their return. I think there is merit perhaps in considering looking at things that other people have been interested in, because they may well be of interest to us. Obviously there wouldn't be the whole exhibition that would be at St Albans, but it would be a small selection of items that have been on the tour. So I hope this makes sense in the context of the other papers that we've seen where we have approved similar loans. Thank you.
Any questions? We agree with recommendation?
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 13, electoral rewires, accounting slot, Councillor Moores.
Thank you, Chair. The report recommends the acceptance of a tender for our electrical rewires for our council houses over the next 4 years. There is another section, obviously, in the confidential session that perhaps I could just refer to three points, really. In paragraph 10.3, it makes the point that this contract is not for a fixed amount of work. It's not a fixed amount of work for a fixed amount of cost, and details, as I say, can be provided if required in the closed session on that. It will depend on the amount of work that we have at the figure that we will be agreeing. That's one thing I wanted to say. It also mentions in the report that this will represent a saving, albeit a relatively small one. And the third point I just wanted to make is that members will be aware that fairly recently we changed our contract standing orders requiring contractors to make sure that they pay the living wage if they're going to accept or if we're going to accept tenders from them. In this particular case, the tender documents were prepared before that decision was made, as it mentions in the report, but I'm pleased to tell you that the contractors who will be recommended in the closed session have agreed to do just that. So I move the recommendations at 13.
Excellent news. Do you wish to add anything, Mr. Roxburgh? Any questions on the reports? We agree with recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you. We could then, item 14, move to exclude members of the public so we can discuss confidential items. Those in favour? Thank you.